Good morning, friends. My name is Jason Clower. Greg has invited me to come to talk to you today because here at Chico State, I'm the China guy. I handle Chinese religions in the Department of Comparative Religion. I run the Asian Studies department, and my whole life revolves around China. When I was in college, I was obsessed with learning Chinese. Spent all of my time with Chinese exchange students, pestering them to speak Chinese with me. 3 days after I graduated from college, I moved to Beijing with the intention of staying there forever. That didn't exactly happen, but I stayed there for 5 years. I converted to a weird fundamentalist kind of Chinese Buddhism. I taught English for a while. I was a very badly failed business consultant. I worked for CNN for a long time. I often got arrested. Finally, I burned out on China and I moved back home. But I took up the business of teaching and writing about Chinese philosophy. And the promise that I'm going to make to you today is that we're going to talk about a pair of kind of twin pair of Chinese philosophies, Confucianism and Daoism. And superficially, they're going to seem somewhat abstract to you. But I promise you two things. First, there are ideas in here that will change your life if you're open to that. And second, that the ideas that I'm going to tell you about today are going to come in culturally very useful in making you seem culturally facile and not like a jerk ethnocentric American whenever you deal with people from East Asia. And that would be China, Korea, and Japan. The things that we're going to teach you today will A, change your life if you're open to that, and B, make you seem cool and knowledgeable to Chinese, Japanese, and Korean people. And we're going to accomplish all of this in 75 minutes. We're going to start back in 500 BCE, when, by some strange coincidence, many of the world's leading religions and philosophies get their start. And even though we're going to be talking about things in the past, once again, I'll be linking it to the present as much as possible to emphasize for you that these have applications today for you if you are a manga or anime nerd, or your dream is to go to Korea and join a Korean boy band, or go to China or Japan and study Aikido or martial arts, anything like that. Or even if you're just going to be somebody like a social worker or a cop right here in California who's going to deal from time to time with East Asian people. So we'll be talking about the past, but I promise you, this has a real world application for you in the 21st century. But our story takes place around 500 BCE, when China was a kind of jigsaw puzzle or patchwork of little independent kingdoms at war with each other, uh, of feudal lords trying to get the upper hand against one another. And each of these feudal lords was looking for smart strategists who would come and help him to rule and dominate his own kingdom and then extract taxes from it and build up a strong governmental and military machine that would help him compete for survival against all the other feudal lords. Think of this as Game of Thrones. And each king was looking for the smartest possible hand of the king in Game of Thrones lingo. And there were lots of itinerant wandering philosophers and political strategists, what today we would call political consultants, wandering China from king to king to king to king, offering his services. The leading such school at that time were these people called the legalists. In Chinese, 法家. The legalists had a very simple, easy to teach, practical program for kings. It could be summed up in a 3-word motto: rewards and punishment. What they meant was that a king should give clear laws to his people, tell everyone exactly what they expect of them. Now, in the 6th century BCE, this was actually a pretty revolutionary idea. Up until that point, in most monarchies around the world, the law was whatever the king said. The law was kind of the king's dictate, was the king's will or even transient moods. Um, that became commands for the people around him. And the legalists said, well, this is going to, you're going to succeed better at getting people to follow your will if you actually codify that in written laws that everybody in the kingdom can read, or if they're illiterate, as most people were, at least have them read out loud to them. And then from day to day to day to day, they'll know with exquisite clarity exactly what you want from them. And then step two, when they obey your laws, reward them, give them a little silver to take home to their families. And when they violate your laws, you will punish them in terrifying, cruel fashion. Legalist punishments, they skipped things like imprisonment and they went directly to flogging, really horrible kinds of beatings. Incidentally, if you're curious how that worked, Google caning in Singapore. The island state of Singapore, which in many ways is still based on legalist principles, still uses the legalist flogging as a punishment for petty offenses. And now in the age of YouTube, you can actually see how this is applied. And it's pretty scary. I would not be committing misdemeanors if the penalty were going to be getting caned. But that was only the lowest of their punishments. For more severe offenses, the legalists would jump straight to mutilation. They would cut off ears or noses or brand people. Didn't take too much in a legalist regime to be executed, and they had more or less gruesome ways of doing that. Strangely, strangulation was considered the most humane, gentlest type of execution they offered. That was for like kind of mid-level crimes. Beheading was considered crueler and worse, even though it would seem to me to be faster and less painless. But they considered that having your head separated from your body and like blood gushing out in these arterial was less dignified. And for really terrible punishments like treason, the legalists had a thing called the palace punishment. The kings have palaces, palaces have harems with concubines in them. The harems need guards who need to be men, but you want them to be men who are physically not capable of sneaking around and deflowering your concubines. And so what you want as guards in your harem are eunuch, men who have been castrated. That was the palace punishment. You would be castrated and then turned into a palace guard at the harem. The legalists liked that as a punishment because it was, of course, cruel and terrifying, and nobody would want it to happen to himself, but also because if you castrated your political enemy, it meant that he would have no further sons who could then come back and avenge their father. So legalist rule was a very simple, blunt object, and it succeeded at bullying people into submission for very effectively, at least for a while. You, even if you don't know it, you are already familiar with one of the great legalist regimes in history called the Qin dynasty. You've probably never heard that name, but you know the dynasty because you know some of the things that they created. The Great Wall of China was built in a very short time span by the Qin dynasty up in northern China to keep out raiding nomads, people who are the distant forefathers of the Mongols. And the Great Wall is it is truly a marvel of engineering. It's a huge, enormous, thick wall with ramparts 2 stories high. Six men on horseback can ride abreast, that is side by side, along the Great Wall. I mean, it's very wide. And every few hundred yards, there's a great big soaring guard tower. And all of this was built in the 6th century BC with hand tools and huge blocks of masonry. How did they do that? Well, by enslaving their own citizens and then driving them brutally and cruelly and not caring how many workers tumbled to their deaths building these amazing pieces of masonry construction. The legalists of the Qin dynasty also built very famous underground tomb for their emperor. And if you've ever been to, say, the San Francisco um, Museum of Asian Art, you may have seen these famous figures. They're called the terracotta warriors. These were man-sized terracotta or clay warriors who were built to guard this tomb in the afterlife. Thousands upon thousands upon thousands of them. And they're each actual, real individuals. They all have unique faces. No two guards are alike. They all have armor that actually comes off. It's this Chinese style scale armor where they actually made little ceramic plates and then threaded them together, just like you would make a real suit of scale armor. They were holding real weapons that now have largely rotted away because they were made of wood. And this enormous complex covers acres and acres and acres in a kind of underground pyramid and necropolis. Incidentally, this underground fortress also had a moat. Now, an ordinary king with an ordinary fortress would have a moat filled with water. But the legalist emperors of that time decided no, they wanted something cooler in their moat. They decided mercury would be really good. Mercury to the ancient mind was sort of like super water. It's a metal, but at normal temperatures, it is in a liquid form, and it looks kind of like glowing silver water. And it's super poisonous, and that's extra cool. Now, you might be wondering, in the 6th century BC, how did they smelt enough mercury to fill a huge freaking moat, enough to make it so toxic, even now, 2,500 years later, that even the Chinese government, which is not weirded out by a whole lot of environmental toxicity, even the Chinese government is not willing to excavate this thing because it's so poisonous. How did they smelt that much mercury back then? That must have been incredibly dangerous. The answer is it was incredibly dangerous, and they just didn't care. They had slave laborers for that. A legalist regime could coerce any number of people into doing anything for the regime through the use of rewards and punishments. Only thing was, it was only effective for a while. It was so brutal and callous that the moment the first emperor of the Qin dynasty, this legalist dynasty, died, before the throne could be passed on to his son, the entire populace of the kingdom saw their chance at liberation from this really unspeakably monstrous regime. They rose up and overthrew this thing. So it turned out that legalism was effective in the short term, not in the long term. Well, back in the 6th century, even though legalists were, for a time, the most popular of these traveling philosophers, because their message looked so simple and easy to apply and effective, there was this other contending school of philosophy who were their opponents. And they were so meek, so seemingly impractical, that they were very much the underdogs at that time. But it turns out they eventually won out and became the official philosophy and religion of not just the Chinese Empire, but all of the countries whose cultures were fed by Chinese culture, like Japan and Korea and Vietnam. This was, of course, the Confucian philosophy. And it was in the 5th century, it was as unlikely that Confucianism would one day become the official imperial philosophy and religion, as unlikely as it must have seemed in the time of Jesus and Paul that Christianity, this religion of the meek, would one day become the official religion of the Roman Empire. But for both of these schools of thought, in the long run, um, playing it cool and emphasizing soft, humane virtues ended up winning the day. Back in the 6th century, when legalism was going strong and seemed like the way of the future, a lot like the way that fascism seemed to Europeans of the 1930s, like it was going to be this unstoppable force of the future. The Confucians had some criticisms of legalism that tell us a lot about the Confucians, and in retrospect, seem very sensible. The, what the Confucians said to the legalists was, we understand that we understand the importance of having clear laws and so on, and we see why it seems effective to you to just to back these laws with rewards and punishments. But wouldn't it be better if you could persuade people with to follow virtue rather than law? That is, what if you didn't need to rely on rewards and punishments to make people behave well? What if you could train people to have consciences and develop good character, virtue, such that the law could be nothing more than a backstop for the very few rare individuals who didn't listen to the dictates of their conscience? We can see examples of this philosophy in action today in modern day Japan, Korea, Taiwan, which is an independent Chinese speaking island off the Chinese coast, which is not ruled by the communists and which remains pretty Confucian to this day. In those societies, visitors from the West often remark on how amazing it is that you can drop money on the street by accident and it will be turned into the local police station by the people who find it, who have little thought of keeping it for themselves. In their minds, it doesn't belong to them. The proper thing to do is turn it into the police. The police will find its proper owners. This astounds Western visitors who are accustomed to a populace who might actually do things that they know to be wrong if nobody's watching. Famously, in Japan, there will be umbrellas in little stands dotting city sidewalks, and those are public umbrellas. And if it begins to rain, you can simply walk up to one of the public umbrellas and take it out and use it until it stops raining, and then you put it back in one of the public bins. And Western visitors will often ask the Japanese residents, "Wait, well, uh, how do you keep people from stealing the umbrellas?" And the Japanese visitors will look very quizzical and they'll say, "What kind of scumbag would steal a public umbrella? These are here for the general populace. They don't belong to us. That's why we don't take them." Bikes on the streets of these cities very often have no locks at all. People just put them outside the shop, they go in and do their business, and of course the bike will still be there when they return. What kind of monster would steal a bicycle? So these societies are living proof that, broadly speaking, this approach can actually work. Teaching people to be their own internal police person, as it were. And the Confucians pointed out that this was actually much more efficient than a legalist regime, where you would have lots of literal policemen and informers spying on one another. Because in any society, even in East Germany, where, if I recall, something like 1/3 of the population was an informer working for the Stasi, the secret police, surveilling all the others, even in a system like that, you can only have so many police people and informers. Whereas the Confucians point out, if you use education properly and you give people a conscience, you can have as many enforcers of social norms as there are people, because each individual person polices themselves willingly. Now, don't get me wrong, there is a social cost to this. The cost is horrific conformity. There's a saying in Japanese. My Japanese isn't very good, but I think I'll get this. Uh, Berukui wa utarareru. The nail that sticks up will be beaten down. These are societies that have very little value placed on being a square peg, um, on being an oddball. Conformity is understood to be the proper way to be. And anybody who doesn't conform must think that they're quite a bit better than other people. They must be pretty antisocial for insisting on being so different. I'll show you a little more of this in a bit when we talk about tattoos. But there is a cost to this, and it's a true psychological cost. The suicide rates in Japan are 3 times what they are in the United States per capita. It can exert terrible long-term psychological pressure on people to live in these societies. But there are wonderful efficiencies. They're extremely safe. Social order is wonderful. Um, you can send kids out to ride the subway all the way across Tokyo, and go and visit like Tokyo Disneyland on their own at the age of 10 if you want. Nobody will harm them. So there are pluses and minuses here. And it all comes down to those countries' Confucian heritage. You can probably already intuit that Confucianism sees the family as an important mechanism in teaching people to do this. You can't get this kind of effect um, without on citizens without cultivating it in them from tiniest childhood. And the schools alone cannot do this. It has to be a broadly shared social norm. People need to broadly agree on what the norms and conventions are that are going to be inculcated in children. And then it's the parents and the brothers and sisters and the grandparents who need to provide this early moral education to kids. And it's important to point out that Confucians thought that legalists had really misunderstood human nature. They had underestimated how good human nature was. They said using carrots and sticks to shape people's behavior, that's something that you do when you're training animals. If you're trying to break a horse or something, you punish it physically. You offer it carrots and sugar cubes, and you keep it in a little bit of fear of what you might do. Maybe you would do that if you were training a terribly feral dog or something. But the Confucians said the legalists didn't understand that people want to be good, that human nature is basically decent and moral, meaning that human beings come into the world understanding that there is such a thing as right and wrong. Now, they might not intrinsically understand exactly what is right or wrong in their society. They need to be taught that and trained in it as children. They need to have uh, they need to have their behavior reinforced. Yes, but they said human beings are deeply social animals. And we have a natural sense of things like reciprocity. As children, we want to be taught the way that we're expected to behave so that we can be accepted and loved by our parents and by the group. And we have a deep craving to enter into moral reciprocal relations with people. And Confucians will point out, you can even find that sensibility in certain kinds of animals, say. Dogs, even dogs, want very much to please their masters. Primates have been found to have their own kind of moral code. Primates have this sense of reciprocity. If you train a monkey that if it does a black backflip or a certain kind of trick, it will get a banana from you. the monkey comes to understand this as being a sort of like contract that exists between you. And so they've done experiments where they train the monkey to do the trick and get the reward and do the trick and get the reward. And then they look to see what'll happen if the monkey does its trick and instead of getting its reward, you just stiff it. And you're like, screw you, monkey. I'm not giving you your reward because I don't have to. I'm in control here. And the researchers have observed in the monkeys what they interpret as righteous indignation in the monkeys, a sense that, hey, you're not playing fair. We had a deal. I lived up to my half of the deal, and now you're shorting me, and you're not just exerting your power on me, you've actually broken a kind of holy covenant with me. You are a bad person. You've done something immoral. And they interpret the monkey's like sour expressions as being a sort of primitive sense of righteous anger, which is something that any human being can relate to. Now, I should emphasize that Confucians aren't stupid and they aren't naive. They're not saying that people always do the right thing. No, no. They're making a more subtle point. They're saying that human nature is inclined to want to do the right thing. Confucians understand that there is criminality and antisocial behavior in the world. And believe you me, in a Confucian society, if somebody seems to be deliberately not conforming to the way of the group, they will be put in their place very firmly. There's a lot of hazing that goes on in these societies to make people. There's a lot of hazing that goes on in these societies to make people accept their place in the group order. But what the Confucians are saying is simply that nobody is born bad. People can be made bad by circumstance, but it takes a lot to turn them from that child who just wants to exchange love with their parents and relatives and do whatever it takes to fit in with them, and to turn that person instead into a hard, callous, flinty-eyed, self-interested predator. It can happen, they accept, but it need not happen in anybody's case. We've all heard before that Confucianism is very interested in education, and it certainly is. That includes education in schools and universities, but even more fundamentally, to a Confucian, education has always meant what they call li in Chinese or rizu in Japanese. This is often translated as ritual, etiquette, or ceremony. These are all good translations. We don't have one English word that equates with li, but you can think of it as etiquette and ritual. As an example of ritual, think of the ritual of shaking hands. I don't know about you, but when I was young, I was actually taken aside at certain points by people in my family, and I was taught how to properly shake hands. And I was taught when to do it and how you give a firm handshake, but not too hard, and you look a person in the eye and you give your name. And the way we know that this is a deeply coded social ritual is by noticing what it feels like when someone refuses to shake your hand. This has only happened to me once or twice in my life when I've offered someone my hand for the standard social ritual of the handshake, and they've either not noticed it or they've deliberately refused to shake it. But everybody notices this, and it sort of makes you gasp. It's a statement of horrific rejection because it's not just a gesture, it's a social ritual. Confucian society is full of such rituals, much, much more than we have. Um, in Western countries, we typically are much lower in ritual than Confucian countries. In America, we're even for me coming from Ohio, I was kind of amazed at just how casual California is. When I flew here for my job interview, I was picked up by the chair of my department, who was wearing cut-off jeans, a pair of flip-flops, sunglasses, and he had to make room for me in his car by moving a yoga mat. And I was like, wow, everything that we Easterners think about California is true. um, so it can be very difficult for us to go and experience the extreme degree of etiquette that's practiced in Confucian countries, where there are elaborate, unwritten codes about how low you bow, uh, how you give name cards. There are ritually coded ways of drinking with people. There's a sort of safety valve in these cultures that practice a high degree of Confucian conformity, where people have to do the expected thing rather than what they want to do for so much of their lives. And that safety valve is that people get drunk together in a particular ritually bounded way. They get drunk, and then under those circumstances, lubricated by wine, they can say certain truths to each other that need to be said, but because everyone's drunk, it's all okay and it doesn't really count. But there is a proper way to do that. These rituals are things that I'll teach you if you care to take my class on East Asian religions one day. That class is largely a class in how you get along practically and come off looking good in an East Asian society. This ritualism also explains what makes uh, Eastern martial arts, and sets them aside from boxing. You can think of karate and judo as being typically Confucian ritualized Japanese counterparts to boxing and wrestling. And the difference, I submit, is that they're combat sports with the usual layer of Confucian ritualism laid on top of them. For Confucius, to be raised to be ritually correct, to have punctiliously good manners, is what he calls the Dao, the way with a capital W, or the path. Um, See, Confucius really believes that in any situation, there is a right way with a capital R and a capital W, a proper way to behave. And that you're trained in that over a lifetime by being drilled in manners, in rituals. And it's knowing that etiquette that makes you that gives you panache and charisma in a Confucian society. I'll show you a few examples. Um, Here we have then President Obama meeting the Emperor and Empress of Japan. And he's been well schooled in doing this because even though he's the head of state of the most powerful country in the world, he is bowing with proper, hugely exaggerated depth. In according to Japanese standards of ritual, this is an incredibly deep bow, symbolizing horrific subordination to the other person. I'm not an expert on Japanese etiquette, but I would say that if you saw Obama meeting his counterpart, the Japanese prime minister, he wouldn't be bowing in anything like this ridiculously low fashion. But because it's the emperor and the empress, and because they're visibly so much older than he is, they get this huge show of respect. Now, down below, we have an example of a man who is deliberately being a square peg in a round hole and kind of giving the finger to Japanese society. Why? Because he has tattoos. Big, ones that he's showing off in public. You probably heard this before, that tattoos in Japan, especially like those sleeve tattoos, are originally associated with the Yakuza, the Japanese mafia. For them, tattoos are a symbol of being an outsider because tattoos have always been taboo in Confucian societies. One of Confucius's particular beliefs about etiquette and the way was that you should never alter or mar your body deliberately. Confucius said, your body is a gift from your parents. Because it comes from them, it's precious, and you should treat your body with the same respect that you owe to your parents. And therefore, it's not your place to modify the body that your parents gave to you. As a sign of respect to them, you should leave the body as it is and not do things like pierce it, tattoo it. And so there's terrific social opprobrium brought to bear on people, particularly in Japan and especially Korea and also Singapore, who dare to get tattoos and then having gotten them, flaunt them like this, tattooing his whole back and then walking around on the street showing it to people. This man probably is a Yakuza or some other person who has decided that he is going to be a social misfit in Japan. And in return, people will treat him like a pariah. Japan is famous for having these wonderful hot springs. They're sort of public baths. And it's very common to be forbidden to enter one of these places if you have tattoos because it makes the other patrons uncomfortable. You seem to be saying that you're like a hostile, aggressive person. You might be a criminal because you have tattoos. I also included this picture of, is this Koryo Air or Korean Airlines? This is one of the Korean airlines. So that we could talk a little bit more about the social cost of ritualism. We said before that this kind of highly conformist society has wonderful benefits to it and also some costs. A few years ago, there were some researchers who noticed something peculiar, that they were studying airline crashes, and they noticed that certain countries' airlines were more likely than others to have crashes. And it didn't seem to be about anything like level of economic development, because you had, on the one hand, Korean airlines, which were leading the world in crashes. But, it was South Korea. They're one of the great economic miracles, and their maintenance was spotless. And on the other hand, you had Israeli airlines being unusually safe. Also, a very well-developed country with great maintenance. But clearly, it wasn't a difference in the maintenance standards or the pilot's training that was causing the South Koreans to have lots of crashes and the Israelis virtually none. And so they began looking for other causes, and eventually they hypothesized, could it have something to do with the cultures of the pilot? And so they went around collecting black boxes, flight recorders, from crashed flights and flights that had had near-miss accidents. And they began listening to them, and over time, they began to be struck by something. That in cases where the plane was beginning to enter a dangerous situation, in some cultures, like the Israelis, the co-pilot would waste no time in saying to the captain, hey, we're in trouble, wake up, do something. On the other hand, in the South Korean airlines, they noticed that the co-pilot might notice that something dangerous was developing, but seemed to feel constrained about bringing it to the attention of the captain. Why? Because the captain was senior to him in the social and company hierarchy. And as the junior person, the co-pilot felt sort of bashful about saying anything that might embarrass the captain or seem upstart or insubordinate. And so in the Korean cockpit, as the dangerous situation was beginning to develop, maybe outside of the captain's awareness, instead of quickly bringing it to his attention, the co-pilot might say something very roundabout to say, "Oh, Captain, I noticed that that mountain over there is getting quite close." And if the captain didn't pick up on the signal and understand that what he was really saying was, "Hey, we're getting into the danger zone," then the co-pilot might wait for a while, kind of uncomfortable and nervous about bothering his superior again. And then he might say something very roundabout and humble, like, "You know, sir, you certainly have many more years experience flying than I do, and far be it from me ever to question your judgment, but just for the sake of my own education as a developing pilot, I wonder, why is it that we're not concerned that the mountain is flying up close to us?" And then boom, uh, a crash would ensue. Because time had been wasted, because the co-pilot sense of Confucian propriety and ritual and concern for the captain's status had kept him from intervening in time. In a minute, I'm going to go and refill my coffee cup. But first, I thought I would take a quick study break and introduce you to my dog, Snoot. Snoot used to come to class with me every day. Now he's over 16 years old. He has one eye, which isn't on display. He's blind, he's deaf, he has Alzheimer's, and he's incontinent. And so he's wearing a little diaper here. And as I'm talking, if you've been hearing a little click, 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 click sound, that's Snoot walking around on hardwood floors in kind of like demented Alzheimer's circles. All right, more coffee, and then we'll talk about Taoism. And we're back. Let's talk about Daoism, the other great East Asian philosophy and religion. Notice that it uses the same word Dao, or way, with a capital W, that Confucius used. Daoism also teaches what it considers to be the right and natural way to live, which in many ways is almost the polar opposite of what the Confucians thought. So we're going to start our story again around 500 BCE, about the same time that Confucius lived. And the story says that about that time, in the west of China, at the last gate that separated, quote unquote, civilized China from the Western barbarians, an elderly man came by riding on a donkey, and he was passing through the last border control point when the guard there, who was a sort of bookish fellow, he was one of these people who takes a job as a security guard because it gives him a lot of time to read. He looked at him and he said, "Wait a minute, aren't you some kind of famous philosopher?" And the man on the donkey, who was sometimes called Lao Tzu, or the old master, responded, "I don't know how wise I am, but people have called me a philosopher." And the guard said, "Wait, where are you going? You realize that as soon as you walk out this gate, you've left the civilized world and you've entered a land of lawlessness and chaos. Are you sure you want to do this?" And Lao Tzu thought, "Oh yeah, I've wanted to do this all my life. I can't wait to get out of this place. I'm never coming back." And the guard said, wait, if you're never coming back, do me a favor. Would you teach me your teachings before you go?" And the old man said, "I'm not really convinced that I have that much to teach. Um, but sure, if you want me to jot down a few things, I'm happy to do it." And so the guard gave him pen and paper and let him use his little guard shack. In a very short time, the old man came out with a very short little sheet of papers that he'd written. And he said, "Well, to the extent that I have any philosophy at all, it's pretty unsystematic, but here you go. This is my best effort." And he handed him the papers and he left. And the papers that he gave him were what Taoists today call the Dao De Jing, the book of the way, the Dao, and its power. And it represents the philosophy of Lao Tzu, the founder of Taoism. And it contained things like this: the highest good is like that of water. Water benefits the 10,000 creatures, yet it doesn't scramble and strive. It's content with the places that men disdain. This is what makes water like the way, the Tao. The whole book contained passages like this that exalt weakness, lowliness, obscurity. And it's a sort of testament of a hermit, someone who thinks like the tombstone of Western philosopher Rene Descartes reportedly says that to live well is to hide well. Laozi's philosophy praised what he called wu wei. Literally, this means non-action, but I would say that a better translation is non-effort. Lao Tzu said, if you want to be happy and if you want to be powerful, be like water in this respect. Water doesn't try to do anything. And yet it has terrific power. If you go and you stand in a stream that's in flow, you'll find that as soon as the water gets up just a little bit past your knees, it's actually really hard to keep your feet in the stream, even if it's not flowing very fast. And then he points out, is water trying to do that? Is water trying to bowl you over by force? No, it's actually being passive. It simply flows downhill. And yet, because it's so yielding and so prepared to go wherever the way, the Tao takes it, it can't be stopped. Furthermore, it's terrifically powerful that it doesn't care where it is, as he said in this passage. Water's content with the places that people disdain. If water flows into some swampy depression and turns into a puddle, does the water care about that? No. Does the water have a sense of spurned pride that says, oh, the oak tree gets to be so high and here I am in this crappy, lowly puddle? No. Water doesn't care about that either. And Lao Tzu points out that also makes water very powerful. Think of this. If you had no preferences, if you had no particular goals, and you were fine with what every day brought to you, whether it was something prestigious and lofty or something seemingly lowly and obscure, if you were fine with whatever came your way that day, really at peace with it, could you ever be frustrated? No. Could you ever feel disdained? No, because you yourself would have no firm preferences. Your only desire, your only aim would be to be whatever that day made you. In that respect, you would be invincible. You have no vulnerability. There's nothing that can happen to you that's going to make you unhappy. So, for that reason and many others, Lao Tzu says, learn to be like water, and you will learn to be unconditionally happy and to be invincible. And furthermore, as a side effect, you will have terrific power like water does. It probably doesn't take more than a moment's reflection to notice that this is in many ways the opposite of what the Confucians were teaching. Where Confucians taught that you should be an activist, you should be an actual exemplar of virtue in your community. You should always do the right thing, even if it's hopeless to do so. Confucius was known as a man who was absolutely unrelenting in his commitment to do the moral thing, even if it was going to be totally in vain. His opponent had a word for him. They said he's the guy who 知其不可而为之, the guy who knows that he can't succeed and still exerts effort anyway. In other words, he's a sort of guy who beats his head against a brick wall. He's going to do the right thing, God damn it, even if it kills him, even if it's hopeless. To that, Taoist said, why? What do you get out of that? What does it serve you to break yourself against an immovable object just to make a statement? Why not be like water? If the situation isn't going to give way, if the world isn't going to conform to your particular idea of what's right, um, why not simply yield to it? You have nothing to lose but your own unhappiness and frustration. Where Confucius said, strive for excellence. Confucius was a big one for constantly trying harder to improve yourself. And this is something that we see in Confucian East Asia today. More than once, I've visited friends in Taiwan whose high school daughter would be up until 4 in the morning doing homework in advance of her college entrance exams, probably eh, sacrificing some golden moments of her youth and probably her health also in the service of striving for academic excellence. To that, Lao Tzu and the Taoists said, again, why? Is there some sort of glory in killing yourself? Why not simply learn to be content with what you are and where you are and what you have now, instead of bashing your head against a wall in an admittedly grand and romantic and glorious looking um, orgy of self sacrifice? But does it make you happier? I think not, say the Taoists. So they would actually say, don't strive for excellence. Be lowly like water. If you're in a place of obscurity and low status, revel in that. Probably you're going to have fewer cares and woes in the long run than a person who is in an exposed position, who's vulnerable to the envy of others and becomes, as they say in Chinese, a target of 1,000 arrows. Where Confucians said, work to be better every day, Lao Tzu and the Taoists were preaching, again, wu wei, non-action, or as I think it's better translated, non-effort. They don't mean that you should literally not act, that you should literally be completely passive and just spend all your day lazing in a chair. No, sometimes to act, to move, to do things is an authentic expression of your spontaneous impulse. But what they mean is do it with a light touch, do it without a sense of intense intention that's going to cause you to be frustrated if you can't attain your desires. Consider, they say, being like an animal. The animal doesn't simply lie like a blob on the ground all day. It gets up and it explores, it sniffs, it enjoys. And if if its purposes are thwarted, it simply goes and does something else. It doesn't have a sense of pride invested in its ends. An animal doesn't have a sense of pursuing a project or attaining fame and reputation for itself. An animal doesn't care what the other animals think of it. Be like that, they say. That is the way of wu wei, or non-effort. Where the Confucians often praise educating others, raising their consciousness, improving them morally, Lao Tzu and the Taoists say, again, why? What does that get you? And who do you think you are exactly that you should be in a place to go and educate other people? Don't you understand that just as you have your nature, which is somewhat unique, they have their own. They don't need you teaching them how to be a better them. An image that Taoists often use is a crane, like a bird, the crane with the big long legs, like a stork, and a duck. And they'll often say it would be a terrible injustice to try to make a crane or a stork like a duck, to look at the crane and say, wow, that bird is a really crappy duck. Maybe we should chop off parts of its leg to make it simulate a duck better. No, it's a crane. Let it go about being the best crane it can be. Similarly, it would be a terrible injustice to go to the duck and say, man, measured by the standards of the crane, you suck. We're going to take your poor little duck legs, we're going to stretch them out and try to turn you into a taller bird like a crane. No, you're going to ruin a perfectly good duck. And also, you're not going to succeed at turning it into a crane. They have their different natures that have to be respected. So they say, this is the same with other people. You have your nature, they have theirs. They don't want your input, they don't want you meddling, and you're going to be happier in yourself if you don't become a busybody who goes around trying to change them. Also, where Confucians say, never be satisfied with the way the world is, work harder to make it even better. What do the Taoists say? You already know. Be like water. Yes, water can attain some amazing things. It nourishes all the plants. Drips of water can pierce a rock given enough time. It can fell a tree. But it does all of these things without any sense of striving. Water, too, has no sense of being engaged in a project or having a goal. Water doesn't exert effort. It simply follows the lay of the land, the way, the Tao. You too can be like that by resigning any sense of purpose and mission. You can actually be much more effective than other people. And finally, where Confucians say hold to ritual, li, and etiquette, Taoists say again, what does that avail you? Why should you train yourself to conform when you could simply enjoy yourself better by being as you are? The Taoists are constantly saying, your problem is not that you need to become something that you aren't. No, quite the opposite. If you have a problem, it's that you insist on being something that you aren't. You already are what you are. There's nothing further to attain. When you cause yourself cares and woes, it's because you just won't accept what you are. This is the mistake that they think that the Confucians make. They spend decades and decades and decades fighting against their own will, against their own impulses, acquiring these unnatural ritual behaviors, when they could have happiness and contentment and success in all of their non-efforts instantaneously by simply deciding, I don't care anymore about becoming something else. I'm myself. So you can think of Confucius and Lao Tzu, or Confucians and Taoists, as being almost the opposite poles, where Confucians exhort you to accomplish something. Lao Tzu suggests, try doing nothing. You'll probably like it better. Where Confucians exalt knowledge, Taoists say, no, actually, ignorance is really underrated. A lot of our time that we spend looking at screens, acquiring information, worrying about current events, arguing over them, could better be spent simply in contentment and wonderment at the amazing shit that already is happening in front of us. Where Confucians say, work to make yourself stronger, especially morally stronger and stronger in willpower. Taoists say, no, no, try being weak and yielding. You'll enjoy yourself a lot better, and you'll win in the long run. You'll be like the guerrilla warrior who evades combat and seeks never to confront the stronger enemy head to head, but simply wins by outlasting them. And where Confucians praise loftiness, attainments of all kinds, acquiring just fame for your virtues and your accomplishments, Taoists say, no, 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 it's much better to be lowly than lofty. You don't want people gunning for you. If you attain a high place, you're only going to acquire a dozen enemies who want to knock you off the top of your perch. You can have lowliness for zero cost at all, and you can learn to like it just as much as you do a lofty thing. And no one is going to try to kick you out of your lowly place. You will then have a life of peace and contentment without interruption. You know, there's a really illustrative story about another Taoist philosopher named Zhuangzi, who had acquired a reputation as being quite a smart guy. And many of the kings in ancient China were looking for his advice, as we said a few at the top of the hour. these kings were in competition with each other, and they were looking for the best advice they could get, just like the kings in the Game of Thrones. Each were looking for the most canny, cunning hand of the king they could get. So the story says that Zhuangzi, a Taoist philosopher, was living the way Taoists do, as a hermit. He had a little hut at the side of a creek in a far off district, and he enjoyed things like fishing and singing to himself in nature. And one day, a pair of heralds, grandly dressed in courtly robes, came to find him. They had been sent by their king to find the great philosopher Zhuangzi and bring him back to court and offer him a job as the king's prime minister. Now, they didn't understand who they were dealing with, and so they naively assumed that this Zhuangzi character, whoever he was going to be overjoyed to receive their invitation to come work in the court. Because they didn't understand that a Taoist philosopher would be horrified at the thought of working at the center of politics when he could be enjoying himself fishing. And so the heralds were very surprised when they showed up at the house that had been identified for them as the house of the great philosopher Zhuangzi. And I think they were picturing somebody who would look old and wise and quite impressive. And instead, they found this old guy with his hair messed up like it hadn't been brushed in days, and a kind of patchy beard, and wearing this like crappy like Obi-Wan Kenobi burlap robe. And he's standing at the side of a creek with not even a fishing pole, but just like a sort of bent stick with a piece of string tied to the end. And they're thinking inside, this is the guy that we've been sent to hire? But they announce, "Oh, Zhuangzi, we have been sent by the great king so-and-so to offer you a job as his prime minister. Aren't you excited?" And the story says that Zhuangzi didn't even pay them the courtesy of turning around. He just kept his back to them as he was fishing and just casually looked over his shoulder and said, "Oh, you people have found me." And he said, "Look, guys, I've heard about your king, and I've heard that he has many great and wonderful possessions. And I've heard, for example, that he has a very ancient tortoise shell, supposedly that dates back to the beginning of the world, an enormous, huge tortoise shell, and that it's waxed and polished, and that it's kept in this fine brocaded silk cloth in an ornately carved wooden box that's kept on top of the altar in the high temple. And once a year, it's brought down and put on the altar, and sacrifices are made before it, and incense is burned." And the guards say, "Oh, yes, yes, we have seen it. It is a most wonderful tortoise shell." And Zhuangzi, still with his back to them, just being terribly rude, says to them, "Well, tell me this. Do you think that tortoise would rather be dead and waxed in a box on top of an altar, or would it rather be fishing here with me and playing in the mud?" The guards are really confused by this question, but they kind of awkwardly say, "We suppose that a tortoise would probably rather be playing in the mud here." And Gonza says, "Exactly. I'm playing in the mud, so fuck off and don't come back." The point of the story is Gonza thinks it would be a terrible thing to attain a position of fame. He wants to be lowly and obscure because that's the place where nobody bothers him, and he can do the things that he really cares about, which are enjoying the grandeur of nature. If you've been listening to what I say about Taoism and the power of being soft and yielding, you might have been thinking about things like jujitsu or judo or Tai Chi, the famously slow-moving Taoist martial art. These are all directly tied to the principles of Taoism. They all involve defeating an opponent who may be stronger or faster, simply by borrowing your opponent's strength and using it against him or her. By yielding. If you've ever seen a Brazilian jiu-jitsu match, you've noticed these guys do not have what we would normally call impressive physique. They're usually dope smoking bean poles who look like they've been deprived of any protein, but they have this incredible Gumby like flexibility. And somebody can get them down on the ground in a position that in high school wrestling would get you pinned and lose you the match. But these Brazilian jiu-jitsu players will then just throw up one of their incredibly flexible legs and catch the guy in a triangle choke or an arm bar. They're not terribly strong, but they're wonderfully flexible, which the Taoists would call yielding. And they can find the way through the weak points of their opponent's defense, just like water flowing through cracks, and boom, choke the guy out. Tai Chi is slightly different. It's more of a striking martial art, or a shoving martial art. But I can tell you from personal experience that a good Tai Chi practitioner, even somebody who's really elderly and feeble, you can grab his arm, and it will actually feel like somebody's taken like rebar and wrapped it in cotton. It'll feel sort of soft and fleshy, but underneath there's something incredibly unyielding. And you can play at sort of play wrestling with these guys, and you can't really push against them. It's like trying to push against cotton candy. There's nothing there to resist you. But then as soon as you get off balance, boom, they give one quick shove that they'll tell you comes from their dantian, from some energetic center, although I suspect it may simply be good leverage and physics, and knock you ass over tea kettle. These things actually work. So the Taoist philosophers, to summarize the foregoing, say that if you follow the Tao, the way, if you can be like water, you will accomplish everything you want to. Now, make no mistake, part of that involves choosing to only want the things that are within your reach. But for them, that's a legitimate move. As long as you make your desires and your capacities match, that's the recipe for happiness. And they say that you will be deathless. Now, what they mean by deathless isn't originally that you would live forever. After all, these are students of nature. They understand that part of nature is change and transformation, and human bodies change, and then eventually they grow old and die and decay. But they mean that you'll be deathless in the sense that if you identify not as a like 5'8.5" person named Jason, but if you identify as the whole of nature, that is deathless. If you really identify with the world, with nature, then you are deathless in that sense, because nature's not going anywhere. Even after the human race has somehow extinguished itself, life will go on. There will still be water and protozoans and cockroaches on planet Earth. Nature will continue. So if you really identify yourself with that, you will feel that you are not going to die. Yes, your body will transform into like dust and moldering, worm-eaten stuff, but you'll identify with this bigger thing that never ends. So that's what the philosophers meant. For them, when they said, quote unquote, deathless, they meant that as a metaphor. But religions are interesting things. Excuse me. People in religions have this remarkable capacity to believe what they want to believe, and also to take things that venerable old founding figures have said and imbue them with outsized, mythologized significance. So after Taoist philosophy had been around for a while, after it was centuries old, some people began to think, wait, what if the founding Taoists, when they said you could be quote unquote deathless, what if they literally meant that you could be immortal and live forever in this very body? And you can imagine the people around them must have said, dude, that's crazy. If they had those techniques of immortality, we would know about it. But there's a certain kind of person who's drawn to conspiracy theories who sort of feels like, but the absence of evidence is proof that there is such a thing and it's simply been suppressed. So this belief grew up among some Taoists that actually there were ways known to the ancients that you could make yourself literally immortal, like your body would literally never die. This became the study of what's called Taoist alchemy. In the beginning, it was what we now call external alchemy, in Chinese, Wai Dan, where people would brew actual elixirs, actual potions of what they hoped would be immortality out of chemicals, and chemicals external to their bodies. That's why they called it external alchemy. And so, alongside the traveling itinerant philosophers of ancient China, you would also get a group of traveling itinerant Taoist alchemists, people like the fellow I'm showing you here, um, who would travel from king to king and claim that he knew a recipe for a potion that would make the king immortal. If the king would pay him, he would whip this up for him. And we've actually got some of these recipes. And let's just say they didn't work at making you immortal. They would include things like cinnabar, a mineral that I think is a magnesium compound. And in China, cinnabar was rare. Here in Northern California, I'm told that it's practically everywhere. But in China, it was very rare, and people were very captivated by it. They thought it was sort of like diamonds, which are super cool, only red. And red is the color of blood and life and vitality. So they're like, cinnabar must be like super diamonds. So clearly, if we're going to have an elixir that can give you immortality, this precious substance must naturally belong in that. So they would grind up some cinnabar and put it in their potion. Um, Also, many of these recipes included lead, like shaved powdered lead. I don't know if you know this, but in the ancient Mediterranean, in Greece and Rome, people would sometimes use powdered lead as a sweetening. Remember, they didn't have sugar then. Uh, and so they would have wine, but it would be unrefrigerated and not well preserved, and it would kind of go rancid after a while. And so they would sweeten it by taking lead and kind of like using a cheese grater to grate some lead particles into their wine, which did, in fact, make it sweet. Of course, it also killed them slowly, but lead would also have a place in these Taoist alchemical preparations. Also, mercury, for the reasons that we talked about earlier in connection with the legalists. To the ancient mind, you can understand how mercury would seem like water, which of course Taoists love. They admire and they emulate water. But because it's metallic and shiny, mercury would seem to them like super water, ultra water. So they're like, yeah, let's put some mercury in too. And they put in arsenic for what was actually a very logical seeming reason. Arsenic is poison, yeah, though it kills you very slowly. But arsenic is a preservative. You can embalm people in arsenic. And so it might stand to reason for them that if you wanted to preserve a body indefinitely, that you should use some embalming stuff like arsenic. And they would put in some like shaved powdered gold and silver just because they're precious metals and, they're so cool that clearly they probably contribute something to making you immortal. As it happens, many of the legalist kings, like the emperor of the Qin dynasty, the guy who built the Great Wall and the underground tomb complex, many of them were very interested in having these Taoist alchemists come and cook up these potions for them. Of course, it's no surprise that they did not actually succeed at becoming immortal, but it took centuries for this practice to die out. The reason is sometimes the potions didn't kill the clients fast enough. They would take a potion that had a really good dose of lead and arsenic and mercury in it. And of course, it would be toxic as fuck. But it would take many doses, maybe over many years, to do this. And there weren't a whole lot of data points because these recipes were so expensive to make that it was only a very few people, mostly kings, who could afford to do this, and not very often. And so, coupled with the lack of like a database that people could consult, there just weren't enough cases for people to compare. Finally, sometimes the religious mind would find a way to make success look like failure. There might be a case where a king had drunk lots and lots of these quote unquote potions of immortality and then died. And people might go to the alchemist and say, hey, wait, what just happened? He doesn't look very immortal. And the alchemist might say, oh, no, you misunderstand. He has left his body behind, the sort of the grosser, cruder element. And he's turned himself into a refined and subtle spirit that now soars through the heavens immortally like a dragon. Again, people who are really invested in religion can sometimes rationalize the most incredible things. However, after enough centuries, people finally lost a lot of confidence in external alchemy, in actual literal potions of chemical elixirs. And they started thinking, okay, wait, maybe what we need to do is manipulate not chemicals that are found outside the body and turn them into potions that we then ingest into the body. Maybe what we need to be doing is manipulating these chemicals inside the body. Again, try to approach this like the way that a very ancient and pre-scientific person might approach it. People who didn't have a systematic knowledge of anatomy. Now, they still knew that the human body contained an amazing array of weirdly colored, interesting fluids and stuff. The Taoists notice there's blood, but also there would be like sort of clear pericardial fluid in the heart sac, or lymph fluid. If you think about like gospel accounts of the crucifixion of Jesus, well, Dr. Kutsonis, he's a much better authority on this than I am. But as I seem to remember, there's one account where after Jesus has been on the cross for a while and they want to finish him off, a Roman soldier pierces his side with a sword or with a spear, and some kind of clear liquid comes out, not blood, but something that looks like water. And I've heard it hypothesized before that that wasn't a miraculous occurrence, that what was coming out was the clear fluid in the pericardial sac, the sac that holds the heart muscle. So they also noticed that there were different kinds of like yellow and green bile type substances in the body. There's semen, which is white, and that was very interesting to the Taoists because it seemed to them like semen must be a particularly life-giving fluid. You know, you put it inside a woman's birth canal and sometimes life comes out. They didn't understand quite why, but they thought, wow, clearly this is really powerful stuff. And so these new internal alchemists thought maybe what we need to do is somehow mix and manipulate and heat and morph the various precious substances that are inside the body that clearly have something to do with the preservation of life. And maybe we should do like special breathing exercises and try to like move one kind of fluid somewhere else. Like there were breathing exercises that were thought to maybe move a refined essence of semen from its place down at the bottom of the body, up the channel in the spine, up to the brain. If this sounds to you, if you know anything about Kundalini yoga or Tantra, if this sounds familiar, it's probably because some of this stuff traveled from China to India and informed their Tantric and Kundalini practices. But long story short, their idea of internal alchemy involved changing the alchemical quest to a quest to master the body's inner energies. And this can be done through breathing exercises, through special dietary stuff. Um, there are unusual kinds of Taoist sexual practices that I'm not going to talk about because it would be kind of awkward and uncomfortable, but you can Google them. Um, a sort of like non-recreational sex that's supposed to maybe eventuate in some kind of immortality. Another product of this was traditional Chinese medicine. Now, personally, I would say Taoists did not succeed at making anybody immortal, but along the way, they learned a lot of really useful things about the human body that became the basis of traditional Chinese medicine, which is pretty darn good for some kinds of maladies, um, especially chronic ailments. For example, in China and the rest of East Asia, it's very, very common, in fact, almost universal, for elderly people to develop diabetes. And I think this is because they live on a diet that's so rich in grains. Um, I would say off the top of my head that like probably 90% of a traditional Chinese diet is carbohydrate, and particularly polished rice that has a high glycemic index. And look, I'm doing hand waving armchair medicine, but they Chinese elderly people almost all get diabetes, and I think it's not helped by this diet. Well, this is commonly treated in China not through insulin shots or even a change of diet like we would do it in the West. It's done through traditional Chinese medicine. Also, other diseases of age like arthritis are treated this way, or nervous disorders. In traditional Chinese medicine, the idea is that the body is a sort of superhighway network of energy channels called meridians that flow mostly vertically, longitudinally up and down the body. I'll show a diagram over here of the human body as Chinese medicine conceptualizes it. And along those meridians flows an energy called qi. Literally means air. In Japanese, this is called ki. Like, have you ever heard of the Japanese martial art of Aikido, which is a sort of a very gentle, kind of a Japanese counterpart to Tai Chi. In that name, Aikido, that this is the word. It means the way of harmonious qi. Qi is thought to flow through the body, and a healthy body has the energy, the qi, running back and forth, up and down without interruption or blockage. Sickness is thought to be what happens when the flow of energy gets blocked or occluded anywhere. Like here in the diagram that I'm going to show you, there's a sort of like angry red inflammation in the shoulder that represents some kind of blockage of qi. Maybe that spot has been confused or somehow injured. And now the flow of energy has gotten blocked because of this temporarily damaged meridian. And so what Chinese medicine seeks to do is to restore the flow by detouring the qi, kind of like the way that if there's an accident on an interstate, the CHP will come along and they'll put up a bunch of detours and reroute the traffic around the scene of the accident while that can be cleaned up. And that's what keeps the whole state from coming to a standstill, because the traffic can continue to flow past the blockage. You can probably already guess, this is the concept that underlies acupuncture. If you've never had acupuncture done before, try it out sometime. Here in California, because we're such a new age woo-woo state, acupuncture is covered in California by people's medical insurance. And so it's very affordable. And here in Chico, there are a few places that you can have it done, like the American Chi Center. And speaking of somebody who's sort of an aging, excuse me, an aging athlete, and gets a lot of dings and energies, I can tell you from experience, acupuncture is pretty darn good for this stuff. There's also a really cool thing that, gosh darn it, just works. It's sort of like the poor person's answer to acupuncture. It's called reflexology. It's acupuncture, well, it's acupressure that you can do on yourself without needles. See, the meridians flow up and down the body, mostly well below the surface of the skin. And so that's why an acupuncturist uses needles to get below the surface of the skin to move the flow of energy. But the meridians come very close to the surface of the body on the palms of the hands and also the soles of the feet. Um, the hand is a very thin place. There's not much meat here, and all the meridians come here to do a little turnaround like an Olympic swimmer doing a kick turn at the end of the pool. And so here, they all lie very close to the surface, and you can reach them just by using finger pressure. And so if you know just a little bit of acupuncture lore, you can figure out what spot you need to massage on the hand to treat your particular problem. And all over China, you can buy books that will have diagrams like this one that show you, okay, like if you've got a lung thing like this cough that I've got going on today, this is the spot on your hand that you need to massage. On the other hand, if there's a kidney issue or a liver issue, this is the spot on your hand that you massage. And I'll tell you, the closest thing that I have ever experienced to like a miracle healing in my life involved reflexology. I was living in China at the time, and I ate a bad piece of lamb, and I got, I think, horrible food poisoning. I mean, so horrible. Like I thought that I might really die. I certainly wanted to die, and I was not going to go to a Chinese hospital. They wanted to give me antibiotics there, and they wanted to do it using an IV, which is more common than injections in China. This was a kind of crummy hospital on the wrong side of Beijing in the 1990s. People were getting AIDS right and left from blood transfusions in China then. And I was like, no freaking way are you going to get under my skin. Nothing penetrates my body at this hospital. So I'm just going to go home and die. And a friend of mine who was from a very poor Chinese village where they didn't have proper doctors at all, and they relied on this kind of stuff for all their medical needs, he came over and he looked at me and said, "You look bad. I'm going to go to the store. I'll be right back." And he came back an hour later with three very strange things. He had a bag of cotton balls, a small bottle of what's basically Chinese vodka, and a really large coin. And he said, "Okay, take off your socks, get on your stomach on the bed, and I'm going to fix you up." He straddled my legs facing my feet, and he took the coin, wrapped a cotton ball around it, and then used the alcohol to sterilize the cotton ball. And then he just rubbed the bejesus out of three reflexological points on the bottoms of my feet. It was torture. He was merciless. And then he said, "Okay, we're done over here. Now I need your shirt off, stay on your stomach." And he straddles my butt and he starts rubbing the hell out of one spot that he said was a meridian, an acupuncture meridian, on my back in a technique that's called gua sha. You can have this done in San Francisco. And in acupuncture, they say that it works by releasing stale qi. You get this huge, bright red, angry looking abrasion. And acupuncturists say that bad qi or stale qi is coming out through this abrasion. That was also extremely painful. And when he was finished, about half an hour later, he said, "How do you feel?" And I was like, "I feel fantastic." I can't say I jumped off the bed, but I could get up, I could walk, I wanted food and water, I was smiling instead of praying for death. It was amazing. It was almost as dramatic as like, a faith healing thing where somebody like leaps out of a wheelchair and they can suddenly walk on this leg that hasn't worked in years. I don't know why, but since that day, I've put particular stock in this kind of Chinese medicine. I I hesitate to say that there is actual evil qi in there, but understand that sometimes these theories that are used, the idea of meridians with energy called qi flowing through them, and the idea that like this point on your palm has something to do with your lungs, sometimes those are just heuristic. Um, that is to say, they may not understand with what we would call scientific precision why the techniques that they worked out over time are succeeding the way they're succeeding. But in many cases, they are succeeding. All that's missing is a full explanatory knowledge for why it's doing well. But you can still take advantage of the perfectly real effect of doing this. All right, I reluctantly have to draw this to a close. I've done a terrible disservice to both Confucianism and Taoism by giving them such short shrift. Um, but I'm going to leave you to the rest of your day and uh, offer to you that if any of this is interesting to you, you're perfectly welcome to come and visit me in office hours. And maybe one day you'll want to take one of my classes on East Asian religion. It was wonderful, quote unquote, meeting you. And I give you back now to Dr. Kutsono. Goodbye.